Flood management options for Edgeware Road at Edgeware Village. Staff have a presentation. Thank you.
Kia ora. We're here to present the flood management options for Edgeware Road at Edgeware Village. A report which was initiated through a combination of community concerns around flooding issues in that area and specific requests from the community board in particular to address these issues. The presentation is effectively in three parts. We're providing a bit of background initially, context setting for the issue of flooding in this area, surface flooding, which, as all will appreciate, is not unique to this area within Christchurch, which overall is a flat, relatively low-lying area relative to where the water can drain to, and hence when we get any significant events, rainfall events, there will invariably be some degree of surface flooding. The second part is an outline of the steps we've taken in identifying and evaluating infrastructure options for addressing the surface water flooding issues in this area. And the third part is an assessment of those options and the recommendations arising from them. I have with me today, as you will know, Helen Beaumont, Head of Service for Three Waters, and Tom Parsons, Senior Surface Water Engineer. And Tom will lead us through the more technical aspects of that presentation.
Fantastic, thanks Kevin. So I'll just quickly run through a bit about the drainage system to start with. It's a low-lying area. We have had frequent flood complaints from the Edgeware Village shops, the businesses in that area in particular, but there are other pockets of flooding in the suburbs surrounding. Essentially, the level of the street is below the flood level in the creek, and that's the primary issue that we have here, so that when it rains locally on the catchment, the water can't, and the creek is up, the water can't get away. And also, it's a long way from Edgeware Village out to the outfalls in the Otakoto Avon River, so there's quite a lot of open channel network and pipe drainage between the two, so there's a long way for the water to go before it can get away. Probably can't see this too well on the screen, but what it's trying to highlight is a bit of the topography, that the banks of the creek are above Edgeware Village, and the red star shown on that map is the location of the Edgeware Village shops on Edgeware Road. And the lighter colours, or the light brown colours in this map, show the lower lying areas that are below the top of the creek. And if we look at this, draw a line between the creek and that star and cut a cross section through, we can see that. And I'll just talk through this just briefly. On the right hand side there is the creek that I've just highlighted. If we draw a line down the centre line of Edgeware Road from the creek back to, say, the Peter Tim's Meats Butchery, that's the black line there. So you can see immediately that the top of bank of the creek is above the level of the road outside the butchery, and that there's crossfall on the road, so the road falls back towards the shops, which is this tan orange line below. And you can immediately see that if the water level gets high in the creek, not even at the top of bank, we start to have a problem, because that is above the curb level in the street outside their shops. And we can see that in photographs quite clearly. Here's a picture from July flooding, and you can see that there's water level ponding outside in the street. But if you look in the far distance up Edgeware Road, that's dry, and the photographs on the right are of the creek at the same time. So the water level isn't flooding out of the creek, but we are seeing problems in the street outside. So we can see from these photos that it really is about the water level in the creek rather than the pipes and the local curb and channel. In terms of investigating this issue, we had a study back in 2018 as part of the Land Range Recovery Program, and we found that there is significant flood risk in the wider catchment. There are about 16 properties at risk of above floor flooding, so where the modelled 50-year flood level is within 100 metres of the estimated floor level. So we don't have a whole lot of very precise data here, but it's not dissimilar to the level of investigation we've done previously for other catchments. So we've got 35 different buildings we believe to be at risk in a 50-year flood event in the wider catchment. Of those, about half are commercial buildings and half are residential. And this prompted some funding being proposed through the previous LTPs. We had about 6 million sitting, not in the current LTP, but in the previous LTP, starting out near at the end of that program to start this project. But that's been pushed back through the current LTP. The project still sits in the infrastructure strategy beyond the 10 years. So we're not anticipating progressing this project immediately. And in fact, you'll see through the recommendations, which I'll talk to later, that we consider the timing of this project through the next LTP when we can consider it in conjunction with a whole lot of other flood risk and flooded areas throughout the city. And that funding was pushed back through the last LTP because of our constrained financial envelope for a whole lot of reasons that you'll be well aware of at the time. So we've looked at three options here from an engineering perspective. Prompted by the community board, we investigated replacing the existing curb, but as we found and shown in those earlier slides, it's not really the curb height that's causing the issue, it's the level in the creek. We've previously investigated back in 2018 a large area catchment scheme, and we also looked at widening the creek downstream. So I'll touch on these options just very quickly. In terms of raising the curb, it's very challenging there with the levels of the shops. They back on the footpath, so we can't really raise the curb without lowering the road. That comes at a very high cost, and as we see, that would actually make the road closer to the flood level of the creek, which would make it more prone to flooding if the creek's up, which would obviously be a disadvantage. However, you'll see in the recommendations put in the staff report that we're not ruling this out entirely. We'd like to keep it sort of on the table through the master planning process. There might be some bright ideas through there, and they might want to move or change the curb through that process anyway, so we wouldn't want to preclude those sort of options through a resolution today. And as I mentioned earlier, in terms of that street drainage, we believe the system has capacity to, although the curb is not full height, we believe the wider system has sufficient capacity to meet sort of modern standard. And also that the flood risk seems to arise in the longer duration events, which again is signalling that the issues are with the wider catchment. In terms of the engineering intervention, we conceived of a large stormwater pump station on Cannon Street, pumping away down to the Otakaro Avon River and putting a pipe network back up into the catchment, up into Edgeware Road. Obviously a very intensive infrastructure option, very high cost. This was done back in 2018, so we'd expect those costs to be even higher today if we were to pursue this option. And in fact, our resolution is to just revisit those costs and put this into the mix in terms of the next LTP. We'd see a reduction in flooding of approximately 8 houses and about 8 shops would benefit from this scheme in terms of a 50-year flood risk. There would obviously be some benefits in smaller events and would see more frequent flooding reduced as well. We did also look at widening the creek downstream, but it was not particularly practical. There's quite a lot of intense development joining the banks of the creek, so we've got a lot of houses, gardens and garages and the like very close to the top of banks. So those past development practices have challenged us, made a challenging situation for us to widen the creek. And we found through other projects that working in people's backyards is very challenging for a whole lot of reasons. It creates a large imposition on those people for a start. And we find that Many people were willing for the benefit of the wider community, but some people find it more challenging to have those works in close proximity to their homes. So in terms of the benefits of these options and disadvantages, obviously replacing the curb, we can do that quite quickly and quite easily. It's just in the street, but we don't see that as being particularly effective. Suggesting keeping it on the table as part of the master planning process, we might be able to deliver it more efficiently, and we might find there's some other ways, some good smarts through that process to deliver some benefit through local drainage works. Certainly consider that wider engineering scheme through the next LTP, but principally we're looking to rely on the district plan. So the district plan sets out flood management process over a long time frame. So we're looking at effectively setting floor levels high enough to reduce flood risk in the catchment with time as buildings gets replaced, and also reduce the impact of intensification on the wider catchment. So in terms of the staff resolution, in solid line there, we're definitely suggesting keeping on with the district plan processes. They're very effective over time, very low cost over time. And the dashed lines are things to keep on the table for now and to consider in future processes. We did go through a process with the community board, and they've provided their feedback. I won't look to surmise that. I wouldn't be brave enough to take that on board. They've provided full and thorough feedback, and that's in the report, and I'd direct you to read that in the first instance. And these are the headings that they'd provided their feedback under, certainly looking for long-term solutions and ideally short-term options in a community focus. So I'll just leave that there for you to consider. The recommendations, as I've mentioned, really are focused on engaging the local community, relying on those long-term processes and leaving some options on the table for those subsequent processes to consider those alternate options. So thank you very much for your time. That's all I have here today.
Thank you. There are a number of other areas which have been raised by councillors in relation to this specific issue, and I know that Yanni's got his hand up, so the area down Maces Road is one of those examples. There were a number of other areas that flooded in the last event, but there were specific reasons why they did. So this has to sit within a wider program of work, surely, and I'm not sure why this one has come forward to council at this stage, ahead of all of those others that have been raised.
Well, I certainly agree with you that there are a number of areas across the city which are subject to frequent flooding, and as people will be aware, they do pop up and come to our attention with disappointing frequency, I suppose. But council's come a long way in the last 10 years in terms of investment in flood infrastructure through the Land Drainage Recovery Program and through the LTP process. We've spent hundreds of millions of dollars on addressing flood risk, and that's gone a long way.
The original focus was on residential properties, so this is moving into another area. So just why this one? And
it came out of direct result of, as Kevin mentioned, from the community board asking some specific questions about particular interventions, and we sought to bring it to council given the idea that we could get a firm decision to enable the community and communication with the community to start with a very strong footing.
But this will go alongside the occurrence of similar flooding in other parts of the city as part of the consideration of potential LTP candidates.
Absolutely.
I kind of You've put in highlight other words, but the words that I think I would rather have highlighted is the occurrence of similar flooding in other parts of the city as part of the consideration of potential LTP candidates, because that to me is the key to what we're talking about here. Yeah.
Yes.
Sam.
Hey, just a quick one, and it might be for you, Helen. Just how will this tie in with, I appreciate we do the work in the lead up to the LTP. How will this tie in with the Three Waters reform?
Under Three Waters reform, the stormwater work is proposed to move across to the water services entity, so this work would move across. So this is about the stormwater network. It's not really about the large floods. So it's not a stop bank project, for example.
Yeah, so just in terms of the priority, though, within this new entity, there's sort of, as much as we could go away, I'm just thinking of the work you're going to do now.
So
I mean,
the new entity would do exactly the same job that we propose to do in the next long-term plan. So the next long-term plan, whether the asset management plan for stormwater is delivered for this council or for the new entity, is still up in the air.
Right.
And so it would prioritise all such projects.
So this won't be a wasted effort as such if we were to look at getting something into the next LTP?
No.
Because
No.
we would literally hand over, or the council at that time will hand over our program of work under our LTB, which will have been signed off before the transfer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we're in fact embarking right now on a piece of work for the National Transition Unit, which mirrors the work we did prior to the previous LTP, well, the current LTP 2 or 3 years ago, which includes the projects that Tom was referring to that are currently sitting several years out beyond the 10-year, the current 10-year.
So, yeah. So I guess to put it a different way, just so I'm really clear in my mind, if we were to look at it the other way and say, okay, in terms of all of the three water assets we need to do work on over the city and what may go into this next into this new entity, I mean, just to be the devil's advocate, would we be better to pull this forward, given that it might be deemed not as high a priority by the new water entity as potentially the sort of the normal stuff we do?
The staff recommendation is not to do that,
Right.
because we haven't considered alongside other areas that are flood prone across the city.
Right.
So what it hasn't done is say, is this more important than the flooding in Sumner Village, for example?
Yep.
So yeah, the advice is not to do that.
So then, just last one, and I'll stop. Is there any merit in looking as we move into the next annual plan for pulling forward some of that work that may not be considered a priority by the new water entity? If you talk about Sumner or Edgeware.
Yeah, that's up to council to look at the priorities for the next annual plan.
So I wonder if we could maybe, as Leanne, maybe add a resolution and perhaps just to request some advice on that for the next annual plan. Because I'm just thinking, going through the back of my mind, is if there's the normal stuff that the new entity will pick up, whether there's any merit in pulling forward within the capital program some of that stuff that may be deemed not a priority by the new water entity.
I mean, this asks for sort of analysis of the occurrence of similar flooding in other parts of the city. You know, I'm kind of reluctant to say that this stands out on its own as the only focus of attention, because there
that's
are
what I'm saying
other
too.
areas that have been raised as well.
So
what you want is to
I just think it would be helpful to inform the next annual plan if there are things, whether it's Sumner or Edgeware, that we go, actually, they might miss out on these new entities.
This asks for an update of the cost of the engineered option. So, I mean, that is not going to happen before the annual plan, I would assume. Maybe you want to give consideration to the range of options, levels of service, council policy, and or maybe you want to look at the occurrence of similar flooding in other parts of the city as part of the consideration of the annual plan, and then ultimately feed that into. I mean, mate, I'm trying to find a way forward that enables the next council to pick up the responsibility around this issue, because we've been looking back, we've been focused very much on residential properties and the flood risks and addressing those, and there's been a huge amount of transformational change in that regard, and a massive investment. This is a different set of issues, but there's more than one area that's affected. So I don't know whether some wording could be done around separating the cost, because updating the cost of the engineered option for this one alone doesn't seem to me to make sense ahead of the annual plan.
With regard to the annual plan, as I think you've alluded to, there is a pretty significant constraint in terms of time frame. We've had a meeting on that yesterday, and we've got a deadline to come back with our capital program recommendations by the 3rd of October. So to undertake a significant body of work meaningfully and reliably in that period is going to be challenging. And we actually had some thought of that with regard to that component of the recommendation and pulled back to the LTP, as that is a more probably a more reasonable time frame and process.
Could we
could we
update the sort of the flooding information in other parts of the city as in order to inform discussions at the annual plan and then to feed into the LTP? I'm trying to pick up on your point, which is to get something, give something a bit of impetus, but not that updating the cost of the engineered option is a massive amount of work, and we've seen the presentation. The engineered option may not be the solution for the long-term investment profile of the city.
Yes, I think weirdly Sarah and I are probably on the same page with this. All I'm saying is that if there is in later years capital program for other flooding issues, given it may not be a priority, then why wouldn't we look to pull some of that forward, or at least have the ability to, if we choose in the next annual plan? That's so I don't know if someone could bring up some wording, but that's all I'm kind of trying to achieve.
Sarah,
just so it gives the next council the ability to make decisions if they choose to.
Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I know that maybe it might just have to be quite high level for the annual plan with more detail for the LTP. And I'd like it to include things like there's some current operational costs that we have. So, for example, most people here probably won't know, but every time there's more than a couple of millimetres forecast in Sumner, we have to pay someone to get a digger out to dig out the beach, to dig out the outfall. And that's quite expensive operationally and isn't always needed. So I think that taking those things into account as well when we're prioritising would be good.
So can we perhaps take a separate recommendation, which is provide advice. Oh, here we go. Request staff to provide advice for the draft annual plan to inform. Well, it's not necessary to inform the draft long-term plan process. To provide advice for the draft annual plan.
And to inform the draft long-term plan.
And to inform the draft annual plan.
Yeah.
But it's essentially to give the option of bringing works forward if there was a basis to. So request for staff to
Just needs the word prioritisation in there
to provide advice for the draft annual plan and to inform the draft annual plan process on consideration of take out other, just put options, levels of service, council policy, and the current similar flooding in other parts of the city.
From the prioritisation program.
Yeah, which would enable earlier priorities to be determined. So something like that, so that you've got the option of the annual plan or the LTP for earlier options. To provide advice for the
we don't actually need to inform in that.
okay, so to provide advice for the draft annual plan and the draft long-term plan process on consideration of options, levels of service, council policy, and the occurrence of similar flooding in other parts of which would enable earlier priorities to be determined.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but as long as it captures this as well, if that makes sense. So as part of that bit of advice, it would have obviously this local issue as well.
Yeah.
So could I just check? The levels of service in council policy framework is a rather large piece of work.
Yes, no, I know.
And that perhaps could come out of that
doesn't need
last
to be in there.
resolution.
Yeah.
Because we certainly wouldn't be able to do that in time for the draft annual plan.
Yep.
No.
We're talking about significant changes there.
Yep.
So if we just do this within the current levels of service and policy framework, we can give you at least an indication of what the engineering options are for this surface flooding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
And the current level of service doesn't address commercial. That's the issue,
That's
isn't
the
it?
issue. So
So the engineered option for this one, where you, if you recall, the 23 million that was estimated back in 2018, there were 8 residential properties that would benefit from that as well. That
Okay,
wasn't
so
just
that
the commercial properties. And remember that this is not in isolation. So this work is still alongside the district plan provisions that now require both residential and commercial properties to have their floor levels above the 1 in 200 year flood. So over time, the city becomes more resilient to these events in both the residential and commercial. So previously, that was a requirement that was only on residential buildings. So that's already changed.
yeah, and I mean, so buildings that are built to a higher floor. I mean, that building that we saw the picture of doesn't have any freeboard at all.
That's right. If a new building was put in place on Edgeware Road there, the floor level would be some 500 millimetres higher,
About that. This new shops are about that.
Yep.
400 or 500 millimetres higher.
Yeah. All right. So, but that doesn't really sort the second one. So, update the cost of the engineered option in advance of the next long-term plan, giving consideration to other options, levels of service, council policy.
We don't kind of need that one anymore because we've got 5.
Yes, I know, but 5.
I think you'd still want us to do that though.
Whether we could just potentially chuck in noting that a high level number might be provided in the annual plan or something.
But didn't staff just say they couldn't get that
No,
detailed?
they can't do it for the annual plan.
No.
So that's the thing.
So that one's
is
specific to the LTP, and the other one's
LTP,
Can we,
and
can
that's the
we,
work that
can
needs
we
to be
just take a minute to do this? I'd rather go on. I'd rather give staff time to write some recommendations that make sense, and perhaps if we could go on to another item and come back to it. Is that all right?
Free at the LTP.
Look, I'm not going to rewrite amendments. Just if people could just spend a couple of minutes on getting the wording, and then I can just deal with a couple of other items on the agenda. So how are we going with that? The other one, are we ready to go back to the resolution? So we've got request staff to prepare a report on surface flooding across urban Christchurch and recommend potential stormwater projects for consideration in the annual plan. How's that? All right. And that's that's fine. So that picks that up. So did we get a mover and a seconder for this? Pauline? Yep. And Phil? So are there additional questions?
Everyone had a chance to ask them first questions. So it's not additional, it's just question on the
All
report.
right, Tom? Yanni?
Thanks. Look, I really appreciate the work that you've done around Edgeware Village. There's obviously been a huge amount of thought put into it. I guess what I'm concerned at, especially with option 5, is how do we ensure that that work happens in the other areas? And if, Maces Road, Bromley is one that I know has been subject to many complaints and requests, and I just wanted to check what resourcing or capacity you would need to be able to go through and do the same sort of assessment that you've done with Edgeware, so that everyone's on a level playing field when it comes to the prioritisation.
So I'm happy to address that. So first of all, a report that's in time for the annual plan won't be as comprehensive as one that would be prepared for the long-term plan. So it won't do everything across the city. However, we will be able to pick up a lot of work that's been done over the past decade since the earthquakes through the Land Drainage Recovery Program, and that had a lot of investigations that didn't make the cut in terms of priority for works. So we can pick those up relatively simply and bring those up to date. We are aware from complaints through our many practices at flood response across the city of where the potential trouble spots are, and we do understand that Maces Road is one of those. So that will certainly be on the list. As will the areas around Flockton the areas out east where they're affected by the tide as well, although there's probably less we can do in some of those. The Barrington Road area is another one that we know floods frequently. So we do know where those areas are.
Sorry, it's like the Edgeware report under 5. We're not going to get as detailed report as we've had on Edgeware Village as part of that. So
That's correct. We don't have time to go into all of the intervention options before the annual plan. However, we do have time.
Yanni,
We do have time to identify
read 5.
the high priority areas.
right, so for the high priority areas, like Maces Road, the person that's made deputations, the community board that's passed a resolution, how do they get the work done similar to Edgeware Village? What's the process to do that?
We'll look at that as one of the candidates and bring it to you as part of the annual plan with a recommendation as to the priority for it.
Right. So we would expect the same level of assessment as Edgeware Village on that.
No,
one.
what we've
Only
asked for in
if it gets to the top of the list, will it then get the same level of assessment?
Sorry, I'm just.
Yanni, read 3. It's update the cost of the engineered option in advance of the next LTP. So that's the.
I get that, but there's parts, and like the only one I'm aware of, but you obviously have mentioned some others where there has been considerable amount of time and energy going into looking at what the issues are. That probably waiting for another 2 years will be quite frustrating for those communities when they see the work that's done on Edgeware.
Please, we've written 5 so that staff are going to prepare a report on surface flooding across urban Christchurch and recommend potential stormwater projects for consideration in the annual plan.
Yeah.
Now, if they don't make it into the annual plan and they need to go into the LTP, then I mean, I'm happy to add the words "and LTP," but there may not be a recommendation in relation to specific ones.
Yeah, but the concern is that when it comes to that process, if we take a overall city-wide approach, which obviously is a good thing, unless you do the specific work on the individuals around what the costs and their options are, they'll probably be ruled out of order for the annual plan because the detailed work hasn't been done.
Just leave it to the next council, so I don't have to put up with it.
Sally can deal with
it. So the Bromley stuff's already underway. So would it be better under 5 if we actually specified 1 or 2 to get the work done?
No. Look, please, this started off as a staff-generated report in relation to particular issues that have been raised at the community board. So I'd just like to leave it where it is at the moment. Phil.
I'm very happy to see this has actually been brought out in the open and brought to the top. Tom, question for you is, on that picture which shows that's from about 2018?
Correct.
Why, just question, the problem is that from downstream from Edgeware Road is blocked, well, not blocked, but restricted quite severely.
Yes.
Is that right? On this picture here, it shows picking it all up and pumping it down to the Avon River by Pomeroy's.
Oh, thereabouts.
Yeah, that's thereabouts. Why would we not just pump it straight along Edgeware Road and chuck it into the top end of Flockton Basin, which is not over capacity, is it? Because Flockton we spend a hell of a lot of money on and it works very well, and that's where this water normally ends up.
We actually looked at that as an option as part of that 2018 assessment and found that it was more cost effective and had greater benefits to push it down towards the Otakoto Avon River than across to Dudley Creek.
Yeah, because what I'm saying is down by Pomeroy's, for argument's sake, when it's really bad, the road floods over. It's not good. It goes over Fitzgerald Ave. So I'm just trying to bypass at least 1.5 kilometres of road and get it into a lower piece of the river, so we don't make a place that's bad even worse.
Yeah, certainly we've designed the Dudley Creek flood remediation scheme to take water from the Flockton Street area down through the bypass and out to the Avon. If we were to put considerably more water into that bypass, then we could have the potential for adverse effects back up Dudley Creek and up into the Flockton Street area.
I'm fully. Oh, you might not agree with me. I believe the engineered option 2 is the only thing you can do. Playing around with the curb height's not going to make any difference. I've actually stood there when it's raining and the water comes out of the sump because it's coming from the
I don't
road.
mean to interrupt, but we're not debating the actual project. We're debating.
But I'm just very pleased that this has actually got to the top because it's a community board problem that's been going on for ages. It's not a problem. It happens because one of the other problems is that if we do this intensification that we're talking about, we're going to have more buildings, more roofs, more everything upstream from Edgeware Road that will go down there and make it even worse. That's what I'm trying to avoid. So,
Right, well, we've got it moved and seconded. So Sarah and then Aaron.
Thanks. First one on the master plan projects. So I don't know if you guys can answer those. Do you know when they're currently planned for? Because as we've seen with Woolston and Linwood and Sumner, that's been good for the village, and why we haven't had them already?
Construction is 2027, 2028 for the Linwood Village. For the Edgeware Village Master Plan.
Okay, because it was planned much earlier. Do you know why that didn't happen?
In the current LTP, it's 2027, 2028, so that would have been a decision in the current LTP.
Yeah. No, I think it was planned several LTPs ago.
I can answer that if you want.
Yeah.
That the community, the business community, didn't want any more disruption. They wanted a rest because of all the infrastructure work that had gone on in that area since the earthquake. They were struggling to survive.
Oh, because it was all past the floodworks and stuff too. Okay.
Yeah.
MCR.
And the other question was on 3.5 with the district cleaning rules and things like that, and new commercial builds now having to have the floor heights, which is really good and protective for everyone. Do we know if some of those buildings that are being impacted at the moment are due to be rebuilt, or if that's in the plans and things?
No, we don't.
Okay. Yeah, I had heard online that that one was due to be rebuilt, but we haven't had that formally.
I'm not aware of any consent application that's come in.
Yeah.
No.
No.
Mr. Higgins,
So maybe
are
not
we
at that stage, but there'd been some chat about it being due for a rebuild. So, okay, thanks.
Aaron?
Yeah, thank you. So just a couple of very, very simple questions. The original flood plan for the area, or stormwater plan for the area, what year was that? The one that currently gets rid of the water?
Those investigations were finished in 2018.
And the system was built that's currently being used when?
1980s was probably the latest significant upgrade down Edgeware Road.
Right, and in that time there's been literally hundreds of new units go in, sealed driveways, the whole lot, which creates all the runoff. Do we do a map that basically logs every hard surface in an area, so we know exactly in 50-year rainfall events and that how much water we get, and then if that water can get out, because it's our responsibility to get to do it, do we do those equations?
The short answer is yes. We track impervious surfaces with time.
Right.
That's part of.
So then when the next application comes in for 6 units on where there used to be 1, and in the driveway and everything else, and we look and we go, can't take it, no. Do we do that?
There's rules around stormwater discharge and runoff, and they're applied through the resource consent and building consent processes. And in examples in this particular catchment where there might have been 6 units replacing 1 house, those, as part of the development, they've had to put in large stormwater tanks and retain their water on site so that they don't have those adverse effects downstream. So the new developments actually bring some benefit. Of course, the old house is typically built at a lower level than the new units, so they'll be set higher, so the flood risk to the building itself is reduced, and also the impact off-site through the runoff is managed.
So then my final question is, with those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of units that have been built and all the DCs that have been collected from those, why is that money not just put aside to do the $23 million to fix their water problem created by their units? They've paid for it.
So the flooding in Edgeware Village has been going on for decades. It's not a new phenomenon, and it's not entirely due to intensification. So it is an urban issue. However, right across Christchurch City, we have roads and properties that flood because they're built in low-lying areas. Some of those we have resolved through drainage systems. Some of them we've had to move to pumped drainage, which is helpful for events, but can also add fragility to your system. So, for example, when you have power outages, those pumped solutions no longer work, and the flooding is exacerbated. And that's why the intensification does bring some benefits as well as some disadvantages in terms of impervious surfaces. And there are, as Tom Parsons has noted, quite a number of examples of developments where they do have to hold stormwater on site and then slowly discharge it into the system. And so that gets over that issue of added impervious surfaces.
Right, but there's still the question on the DCs. Do we not? I mean, area-wide, there would have been a really big amount collected in and around there. Why is that not just applied and then fixed the
So
problem?
development contributions are applied to the issues that they're collected for. However, they still have to be prioritised across the city. So they're not the development contribution, if it's collected on Edgeware Road, doesn't have to be spent on Edgeware Road. It still goes into stormwater or parks or whatever across the city and is prioritised according to where the need is greatest.
Right, so you build 100 houses here but put some infrastructure over there, not there. That doesn't
Sometimes.
make sense to lots of people.
It does make sense if the issue over there is more severe than the one here.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Pauline?
Thank you. Look, what came up during the discussions around the flooding there at the board was the cycleway outside of the liquor store, and it seems to collect the water in the cycleway, and then people can't get across the road to the shop. So, has anyone looked at that to remediate that? The one suggestion was a little hole was cut in the concrete to let the water out. I've got a photo of the owner of the bottle shop making a bridge across the cycleway so people could get in.
I've certainly observed that flooding in the recent events and seen the cycleway flooding. We haven't gone into the level of investigation on that particular issue. Obviously, the cycleways are designed to a standard, and presumably it met that standard during the design process.
Yeah.
It would need a specific little piece of work to really provide you a comprehensive answer to that. Sorry, it
Well,
might
that would
be enough network inletting into the system. Could
Yeah, it'd be
more
appreciated if you
something.
could have a look at that, because it's then these events are increasing in frequency and severity, and it just makes it kind of a little contained river there. So it might be a quick fix. Thank you.
Yeah, I suspect that it suffers from similar issues as we see further down Edgeware Road, that is relative to the creek level that's causing the problems in backing up, so that the water can't drain out of the system and collects in the cycleway.
Well, it's almost like if it wasn't in the cycleway, it would be able to go out onto the road, the water.
I really do want us to get onto the debate. Yanni, you had another question?
Yeah, appreciate that there's like sort of longer term or medium term work that needs to be done, but just in terms of the immediate, my understanding is council has a temporary flooding defences fund, and also we did look at a number of temporary flooding defences through the land drainage program or the mayoral task force into flooding. Has anything been identified that could be done to assist in the more immediate in terms of Edgeware Village around temporary flooding defences when it rains?
There's certainly some on-property work that could be considered by various shop owners to help reduce the flood risk to their individual buildings, and I think we'll cover that off with the Resolution 1 when we approach the community. We can have a conversation with those individual business owners about what they might do to help reduce their flood risk. We're also looking at the community board also suggested looking at backflow prevention up that pipe network, and we'll consider that, although the chances are that it won't be greatly beneficial. In terms of localised pumping, we can think about localised temporary pumping, but the issue with that is where do we pump it to? We get flooding in the street when the creek's up, so we can't really put it into the creek, or else we'll make flooding in the creek worse. And if we push it around the corner, we know that there's other access and surface water ponding issue further downstream elsewhere in the catchment. So there are certainly some challenges there for on-street type level
But do we still currently have budget available to support some of those temporary flood defences?
The Mural Task Force was focused on the residential dwellings. So I mean, can we just provide an answer to that separately? I really want us to move on to the debate, because the debate is what matters in front of us today. So if that's the last question, it can be supplied as a written answer. So can I open it up for debate, please? Pauline?
I just want to, thank staff for the work on this. I mean, and thank you, Leanne, for after 2014 setting up that mayoral task force for flooding. That was an excellent move. And then from there dropped out the land drainage recovery program. And I was involved in the working group at that time. And it opens your eyes to the ginormous complexity of draining Christchurch and keeping people's homes dry, and the engineering challenges and the expertise that we have in this building is actually incredible. So I guess Edgeware is lucky in a way that that area benefited from some of the work around Flockton, and it was discounted to address that area at the time because of the challenges with the St Albans Creek option, and it wasn't the best option, as Tom has just told us. But look, bringing this work here today has actually showed us all the complexity and the fact that there are other areas around Christchurch that also have these problems. So I think it's great to see it's all clarified for us, but we do need to put it into a priority program, and looking forward to, if I'm here, picking that up and continuing that both in the annual plan and the LTP. We spent quite a while at the board looking at one there and encouraging staff to actually get a really good relationship with these businesses affected, and to work with them to try and work out any small things they can do to mitigate the impact on their business. No one wants to see businesses suffering. We all want to help where we can. We do have to have a citywide lens, as Yanni and Sarah also have issues in their areas. But I'll be doing my best to make sure that this gets looked at as soon as possible, along with other areas. So once again, to recognise the staff for the incredible work here. It's massive engineering options that you've explored. And that 23 million in 2018, it's anyone's guess what that would be now. Could almost be double. But that will be revealed in due course. So I'll be supporting this today. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Sam?
Just really, really briefly, I think this is a really good example of why three waters should remain in council's management. Because if you take a really basic example where it's been raised by local people, gone through the community board, comes to a democratically elected council, where we've made decisions to prioritise stormwater flooding issues right across the city in terms of our next budget round, I think we would be at grave risk under these new entities should they proceed. So I just think it's a good timely reminder that local democracy does work, and actually this will provide options for the next annual plan where we can make informed decisions after talking to the community, and I'm not sure you would get this under what they're calling Entity D. So I think we should always be mindful of that.
I'll put the motion. Oh, Aaron.
Yeah, I agree with both speakers. I'll just be really quick. It is our responsibility to get rid of the water around people's homes and around the businesses and on the streets to keep them safe. And this has been a problem for decades, and we've been collecting all of those DCs in that area for all those years. We need to stop spending as much on some of the nice to haves with the DCs and spend on some of that core infrastructure that lets your city keep operating. And we need to get it right and spend it in those areas a lot smarter and quicker.
Yanni?
Okay. Look, I mean, I do want to acknowledge the work that the staff have done in terms of Edgeware Village. And I mean, obviously there's a massive amount of detail that's gone into what the issues are and what the options are, and that's good. But I do think we do need to make sure that we've got other areas that are getting the impacts of flooding, that we still haven't had a flooding debrief from the events that we've had in the past. And what's really important is that when we do have these flooding events, we do actually get a debrief as a council to look at making sure that we're assessing where the impacts are, both on residential and commercial and local businesses, so that we can have some understanding of what the challenges are. And there's no doubt that we've done a huge amount with the mayoral task force on flooding, but I am worried that we do lack the visibility around a number of projects and communities to try and improve or reduce the flood risks that's happening. And Bromley Maces Road is a classic example where there's a new a bus company that's gone in there, right in a hotspot of flooding that gets access issues, and we've enabled some land use planning to happen there. So, I just think we need to get it on top of the city-wide approach, and we need to make sure that we have resources to do the assessment. I was going to say that obviously, the Three Waters is of concern. I totally agree that, there's no way that these local priorities in terms of a big entity could be taken into account in terms of the representation that's currently proposed. And also, I did wonder whether in terms of stormwater, whether we still need to be making the case that gets taken out of what's being proposed. I'm not quite clear where LGNZ's position is, but it would seem to me that having stormwater remaining with council is pretty integral to a lot of the things we do, because we've just heard, for example, like the master plan projects, they actually have an impact on stormwater. So you can't do roading, village upgrades in isolation of looking at the impact on stormwater. So yeah, I agree with the concern that Councillor McDonald has raised. I support us doing more work in other areas, and I look forward to getting that information back so that those communities can also get a sense of the work that we're doing in terms of prioritisation.
Sarah?
I wasn't going to speak because I thought this was relatively straightforward. I will, however, point out that development contributions that go towards stormwater help pay for over $50 million of Dudley Creek work in that area. So, thanks.
Thank you. I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried. Thank you.